College football in jeopardy, of course. We discuss each and every day here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Invite you to lock it in here. Like the videos, comment, share on social media, and of course, subscribe right here for daily live streams and also, of course, content posted every morning here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Got Mike McDaniel on the line. You can catch him on his podcast, Hokie Hangover, allhokies.com through si.com. It's allhokies.com. Mike also worked on the pregame for Virginia Tech football at ESPN Blacksburg. Mike, it's been a while. How you doing?
Hanging in there, trying to get through summer. It's been a very weird year just in general with everything going on. Hoping that there's going to be college football. Last week it didn't look great. This week it weirdly looks a little bit better. At least there's been some positive news. Some schools have, kids not testing positive and things of that nature. So, maybe there's a little bit of hope still. When everything looked so bleak last week. But I certainly hope we have a college football season. I think it'll be the one thing to divert everybody's attention from with everything else going on in the world right now. But they're going to have to find a way to do it safely.
Quite a year 2020 has been. So we certainly get the numbers, as you just alluded to, in regards to the number of whether that be, and people need to be careful when they read the numbers. Sometimes it's a number of athletes, fall athletes that have been tested, not necessarily just football players at a particular program, but athletes. And then also the numbers that I would like to see is the outcome once they test positive of, okay, how are they responding? Are they responding as many of us anticipate as the youth of America has typically responded to this? With the last figures that I see have well over 80% of the casualties over the age of 75, and many of those in nursing homes. So we got to put some numbers into context. This is a severe, important, and critical situation on many levels, but also let's understand that there is a huge disparity between the reaction of age groups and classifications of health and underlying circumstances and health issues.
It's a mess. It is a mess. I'm just hoping, for the sake of everybody, I just hope that there's a vaccine, some sort of therapy, something that comes sooner rather than later. There's been kind of mixed reports on that. I'm very interested to see kind of what direction that goes in. But it certainly would be nice for college football to be played this fall. I know a lot of schools, from just a dollars and cents standpoint, really need the football season to happen. We've already seen kind of the consequences of, basketball tournaments and things of that nature being canceled. We've seen schools already, make cuts to some of those non-revenue sports, so to speak. Nebraska was a school that was one of the first out there, had to dump their wrestling program, which was very unfortunate. But that's just kind of scratching the surface. We saw that Stanford not only canceled several seasons last week, but they also just ended varsity sports. They had the largest number of varsity sports out of any school in the country, upwards of over 30, which is like 7 or 8 more than the average across all of college athletics. And they had to get rid of several of those: fencing, polo, swimming. It's been a mess. So I'm just hoping, for the sake of all these athletic departments, that, you're able to, figure this out and find a way for football to be played. Because even if, there aren't going to be fans in the stands, or even just full capacity, even if they do let some fans in, the money is made with these TV contracts. And if you don't have college football, there's going to be a huge hit from that standpoint as well. So here's hoping that they find a way to get this thing done safely in a manner in which, these games can be played.
And that's one of the big reasons why certainly college athletics and college football in particular is just a spectacle when you talk about 75 to 100,000 people in a stadium, the bands, the atmosphere, the overflow with the tailgating, and all that is paramount to the impact of college football and how it moves us emotionally and the experience. But when it comes down to dollars and cents, while that is a significant slice, it is a slice compared to the TV revenue. And that's why, from a business standpoint, it's so much more important just to get these athletes on the field to play games. And so the rest of us can just sit home on the couch, soak in the advertising that runs the whole deal when it comes to like 90% plus of what the revenue is for these Power 5 conferences. It's the game experience via via television and digital and so forth. Again, it's Mike McDaniel on the line from allhokies.com. Hokie Hangover, ESPN Blacksburg. Mike always challenges me more than anybody else to be able to keep up with all his various outlets that you can catch him on. But again, does a great job and has joined us for a number of years. As always, we will be reviewing your comments, your debate topics, your questions in the chat room. So I will go through that as Mike and I discuss ACC football. One of the early comments here, Mike, if you didn't know this already for being here for years and years on the show, Mike, actually, this is a smoke screen. As Kyle has unveiled here in recent months, he always lets everyone know, first and foremost, that basically this Voice of College Football and all this college football talk is just kind of a smoke screen for my vice presidential candidacy in 2020.
I'm looking forward to hearing that call from either the president of the United States, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden himself. And Mark, I know you well beyond college football, but I'll leave those views private between you and I.
Absolutely. We'll do that. Although some have speculated in the live chat many times, and mostly on an accurate scale. All right. Again, Mike McDaniel talking ACC football. We'll bring in Pigskin Pete from YouTube here in about a half hour to talk up the ACC. So just to lay the groundwork for everybody out there, I think it's pretty well known to the typical college football fan that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have decided conference-only schedules. They are going to completely rework the schedules, at least in the case of the Big Ten, to go to a 10-game season. And again, all conference games. Obviously, that affects the other three conferences because there were cross-sectional games between all of them. The latest I've heard from the Big 12 and the SEC is that they're looking a little bit later to the end of the month to say, by the end of July, we need to know and make an announcement of where we're headed. The ACC has pretty much been in a similar situation. And Mike, so I've heard all sorts of various scenarios in regards to what way the ACC could go in all this. Option one would be, of course, go the route of the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and eliminate the non-conference games. Unfortunately, we've lost Mike for a second. There he is. He's back. So, Mike, if you can hear me, the ACC obviously could go the route of the Big Ten or the Pac-12 in regards to eliminating the non-conference schedule. I've heard a number of other ideas with the close proximity geographically to the SEC and all those established rivalries that we enjoy on the final weekend of November. Georgia Tech, Florida State, Louisville, Kentucky, Clemson, South Carolina, that they want to preserve those games. I've heard a number of possible variables there. Where do you think this could be leaning?
Yeah, so there's a few things. The fact that the Big Ten canceled the non-conference schedule was significant to a number of ACC teams. That led the ACC and conferences all across college football to evaluate how they were going to play some of these early season games this year. The pod system was something that had been proposed where maybe they do away with some divisions, right? So maybe the Atlantic and Coastal kind of cease to exist for the 2020-2021 season, and instead they try to do this geographically. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot more sense than playing conference-only football. There are indications, right, when you have this pod system that you'd play schools close to your geographic area. So in Virginia Tech's case, for example, they would play schools such as North Carolina, NC State, Clemson, Wake Forest, Duke, UVA. Those would kind of be the schools within their pod. I think that makes a lot of sense for schools in close proximity to one another, but then what happens to schools like Miami, Because even if you look at Miami and say, oh, they can play Florida State is so far away from Miami. It's, on the panhandle versus all the way down at the tip of Florida. So it's just two completely different areas and locales in the state where it literally takes 8, 9, 10 hours to get from one place to another. It doesn't really make any sense for them to be kind of in a geographic pod with one another just because they're even from the same state of Florida. It's such a huge state. So there are pros and cons to that. There's also pros and cons to playing or not playing conference games. I personally thought the decision to cancel non-conference games was made a little bit too early. Number one, the reason why I thought that was because a lot of these programs, they returned to school. They had players who were participating in voluntary workouts already. Really, unless you're unable to bring students back to do those voluntary workouts, in my opinion, there's no reason to make a decision on what's going to happen with the non-conference schedule this far in advance. It's not like one school is gaining a competitive advantage over the other if they've all returned. Now, the thing that happened last week with that announcement from the Big Ten was it was on the heels of Ohio State announcing that they had to cancel voluntary workouts. Well, if the Big Ten goes ahead, they make that announcement saying that there will be no non-conference games for football in the 2020 season. And then sure enough, this week, less than 5 days after they made that announcement, Ohio State said, oh, all those kids for the football program that tested positive, they've been quarantined. We have a plan in place for them, but now we're going to bring kids back for voluntary workouts again. So it was less than a week between when Ohio State decided they were canceling the voluntary workouts for football and a number of other sports and the time that they reinstated it. And during that time, within 24 hours of that time, actually, the Big Ten elected to cancel all their non-conference sports. And you have to think that Ohio State's decision was a catalyst to that. So the biggest issue I've had with all this, Mark, to kind of go back to the original question, the biggest issue I've had just kind of with scheduling and what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, and just kind of the season in general is that it doesn't really seem like there's been any uniformity. Now, I know Sports Illustrated broke a story this afternoon talking about the Power 5 conferences all getting their heads together and trying to figure out a way to have uniformity in testing guidelines, which I think is significant because to date, we haven't really seen that. It's been kind of each school and each conference doing their own thing, which has led to a ton of uncertainty as to whether or not the season is going to take place. It almost seems like there were certain schools that were prepared and had a plan in place when kids inevitably tested positive. And then there were schools who really didn't have any sort of plan in place. And that's the problem I have with it, Mark, is that it feels like there just wasn't any sort of planning from some of these schools when these kids tested positive. It was almost like, okay, let's bring them back for workouts. Let's hope they don't test positive. And if they do, we'll just figure it out from there. And that's just not the way to handle things when you're less than 2 months out from the start of the football season.
Yeah, and you got to think that I try to refrain criticism of situations in which I'm not having to deal with it because we on social media make a habit out of looking at crisis situations and saying, I would have done that or I would have done that because it's obviously easy to do. But considering that this all came down the second week of March and it became a very serious issue almost immediately, within a couple of days, it went from something that we knew was out there as a threat to health in general to bam, this is affecting athletics and the ability to compete. Boom, the NBA's off the radar. Boom, conference tournaments in college basketball are being canceled like that. Well, as soon as that happened, there had to be some foresight to, okay, it's the second week of March, and we hope for the best. Some people predicted, oh, this is only going to last for a few weeks. But there had to be wiser heads that would prevail in regards to planning. Okay, football's coming. We've canceled within 10 days. The entire sports season in the spring was canceled. Therefore, it doesn't take a genius to say what's next. Oh, fall sports and primarily football, where we make almost all of our money. What are we going to do? What are the scenarios? And that was 4 months ago. And so some of the things that you're pointing out are rather alarming, that institutions of higher learning would not be prepared for, you can't be prepared for everything. And we're dealing with uncharted territory to a certain extent, but we started to deal with it in March. So there was at least a case scenario of this is what can happen. Okay, let's forward think to the fall. and we have at least a runway to prepare ourselves.
Right. I mean, there was lag time, there was lead time. There was an opportunity to have contingency plans in place, to have uniformity in testing plans in place. Like the conferences, it almost seems like just didn't really coordinate. And I think that's the biggest issue. You have the Big Ten making their decision. Then there were rumors about the ACC potentially making their decision about non-conference games last week. And then that didn't end up happening. And they said, we're going to reevaluate at the end of July. Meanwhile, the SEC said really not much of anything. I know Greg Sankey made the statement that he's not feeling great about the prospects of the college football season. But outside of that, they haven't made any sort of decisions or announcements about decisions. And it seems like a lot of the schools down there are actually doing pretty well in regard to testing. So I don't know. I mean, kids aren't, in the schools where kids aren't testing positive, Notre Dame was the first very notable one that kind of came out with their testing results and said, look, we've brought all these kids back to campus and nobody from our football teams tested positive. And just around that same time, North Carolina and Ohio State both shut down voluntary workouts last week. So you're getting several schools who are doing quite well in regards to like how they're handling things and how they're keeping the safety protocols in place and preparing their student athletes in the best way possible to be safe while they participate and prepare themselves for the college football season. But there are other schools who have kids who have tested positive and maybe aren't doing as great of a job. And at what point do you blame the school for not being prepared? And then at what point do you just blame human nature and the fact you can't really control a virus? Because unfortunately that is the case. You can take preventative measures, but you can't control whether you catch something or not. And that's something that I wish a lot of conferences and just college football teams and programs in general had a better grasp of, and just had kind of contingency plans in place. And the fact that they would be more prepared for this is pretty shocking after we've been kind of living in this environment now for a number of months.
Got Mike McDaniel on the line with us to talk ACC football. You can catch Mike on his podcast, Hokie Hangover, allhokies.com. That's part of the SI.com network. Again, it's allhokies.com. And Mike contributes to the Virginia Tech football pregame at ESPN Blacksburg as well. We got Pigskin Pete going to join the conversation in about 10 minutes as well. You named one football program, and I'm not going to say Ohio State. That was one that you gave a case example, but you named another one that if we want to fire up the live chat, and I've experienced this now ever since the Big Ten made its decision, and then the rollover was, well, what if everyone else does this? Oh, what about, and if we want to see the live chat get sparked up here, Notre Dame. That gets people riled up. I went on like a 10-minute rant, so my opinion is out there, not so much in regards to what Notre Dame should do, because Notre Dame needs to do little at this point, but what the ACC should do. So what are your thoughts about the Notre Dame situation? Because I think as it unravels, I don't think it's going to be very controversial. The ACC is going to allow Notre Dame to participate, and then the contract's going to continue in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, Notre Dame has been a de facto ACC team for a number of years, and people get fired up because they don't join a conference, and they're, people call them elitist, and their NBC contract, Mark, pays for their entire athletic department. And as long as they have that and an opportunity to be on national TV every week, they're going to stay with that as long as possible. First of all, it's not talked about enough how gigantic that is for recruiting. When you go to the house of a 4-star kid and you say you are going to be on national TV every single week at Notre Dame, every single one of the road games are on national TV. Every single home game is on national TV. You're not worried about, Raycom Sports and the ACC network and, all these other regional sports coverage platforms picking up your game. You are on national TV every single week, on NBC, no less, right? And that is a huge, huge recruiting chip for kids that are elite level athletes that want to be seen for an opportunity to go play at the next level. It is gigantic. So the NBC contract pays Notre Dame very well. It's huge for recruiting. Notre Dame is a tough school to recruit to because of its academic standards. Sometimes they're not able to get some of the elite guys into school. That's been the case for a long time. Brian Kelly has done a pretty nice job since he's been at Notre Dame, still being able to compile top 10, top 15 recruiting classes, which is why they've built a consistent winner there in South Bend, but haven't necessarily eclipsed into the upper echelon with schools like Clemson, with schools like Ohio State. It's just in Alabama, these schools can get some of these elite level kids in, whereas Notre Dame's academic standards, they can bend. I mean, to pretend like they don't bend the lines of, in the academic side of the house to get these kids into school would be crazy. Of course they do, but they can't go to a length that some other schools can just because of the ridiculous academic standards they had. I actually applied to Notre Dame out of high school. Notre Dame at the time, when I applied to college, 2010 going into 2011, had an 8% acceptance rate. So it's basically an Ivy League school, and it's very difficult to get into. So they try to hold those spots for the athletes. They try to get all these athletes into school as much as possible. That's a big draw for some of these elite level kids that are able to get into schools. The fact they're going to be on national TV every week. So as far as the ACC is concerned, Notre Dame's been playing a de facto ACC schedule for a while. They have a number of ACC teams on their schedule every year. As far as how Notre Dame fits into the conference conversation for this year, if you go conference only, the ACC would not be very wise to strong-arm Notre Dame during a pandemic. Notre Dame brings in a lot of money for the ACC. It's a very mutual relationship. The ACC also brings in a good amount of money to Notre Dame as well. But Notre Dame's going to be fine one way or another. To say that you're going to strong arm one of the richest programs in college football is just absolutely outrageous. I've seen that floated around a lot, but I don't think that would be a wise move for the ACC when they're trying to generate as much revenue as possible in the middle of everything else that's going on right now. So I think it's going to be pretty seamless. I think Notre Dame's going to play a number of ACC teams already on the schedule, and then they'll add a few should they have to go conference only in the ACC. I don't think it'll really be that big of an issue, and I think that's probably the way things should go for this year.
So my thoughts were a little bit different in regards to an ACC stance or what I think it should be. And again, I might be cutting off my limbs if I were the ACC commissioner, but John Swofford only has one more, I believe, complete calendar year of sports to be ACC commissioner. So he could make himself legendary status if he was able to cement a Notre Dame deal and get them in the conference. And 5 decades from now, people would be saying, what brought Notre Dame into the ACC? John Swofford, he would be a legend. So my recommendation was to strong arm Notre Dame and give it a go and say, hey, if we get turned down, we continue the contract in 2021. But yeah, so anyone can check out my thoughts because I was pretty adamant about what I think it does to the football credibility and the perception of the ACC to have this kind of deal. I just can't imagine, and I'm going to pick on the SEC and the Big Ten, or elevate the SEC and the Big Ten to put it more accurately, as I can't imagine those two conferences in particular allowing that to be done to them by any particular institution. We'll join you across the board in all these athletic areas, all these sports, but not football. I just can't imagine it, even though it's obviously mutually beneficial, as you point out, as Notre Dame brings fans to the TV screen and to the stadiums of the ACC in a conference that's largely kind of marred by mediocre programs to a certain extent after you get past Clemson and what used to be Florida State, Miami, and possibly North Carolina this year, and puts a Wake Forest or a Boston College, run it down the line on the map for that particular week as an ABC, ESPN, or NBC game. All right, we got Mike McDaniel on the line again. It's Hokie Hangover, allhokies.com, ESPN Blacksburg pregame for Virginia Tech football. And, it's the conference that's Clemson and everybody else, and it has been since 2016. I'll hit you with the one team that I think has a chance. I don't think it's probable. I think the possibility is even minute, but actually even broadening out to the entire landscape of the entire country, this is the team that fascinates me for this year, and it's Mack Brown's North Carolina Tar Heels.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be really good. There's no question about it. A number of games last year in conference play decided by 6 points or less. I mean, they were in every single game they played. Look no further than the Virginia Tech game that went to an ACC record 6 overtimes. It's clear that North Carolina has a strong base with Mack Brown. He's an excellent coach. I think a lot of people were a little bit too quick to judge that hire. I think it's safe to say a lot of people were wondering, okay, well, Mack Brown makes some interesting comments on national TV when he's a studio analyst. So how does that translate as a coach coming back into the college football game? Well, he could always recruit at Texas. He was recruiting well at North Carolina the first time. So the fact that he stepped in and all of a sudden recruiting is great again for the Tar Heels shouldn't really surprise anybody. Sam Howell is one of the best quarterbacks in college football, and he was only a freshman last year. He's stepping in as a sophomore with all of these expectations, and that's going to be the key to North Carolina's season is how does Sam Howell go from year one to year two and avoid that sophomore slump? We see it so often, and that doesn't mean that Sam Howell is going to be bad. I'm not saying that. I think he'll be very good, but will he be as good as a year ago? All these teams now have film on Sam Howell. They'll understand his tendencies. So it's up to Sam Howell. It's up to North Carolina's offensive coordinator, Phil Longo, and Mack Brown to try to figure out ways to keep Sam Howell comfortable now with teams being a little bit more familiar with what he can do. We saw from year one to year two with Trevor Lawrence that he took a little bit of a step back. And that doesn't mean that Trevor Lawrence wasn't a very good quarterback last year. He was, but we saw him take a few more chances as he became more comfortable in the Clemson offense, and we saw it not always pay off. For the Tigers. Of course, Clemson makes a national championship game, so it's all relative. But Sam Howell going from year one to year two and how he makes that progression as a starter and deals with the expectations and deals with, opposing coaches and teams understanding his tendencies, that's going to be very, very important to North Carolina. And, the Tar Heels, they do have to replace some talent on the defensive side of the ball, but their defense should be solid in year two under Jay Bateman. It's another very good unit, should be a top 4 or 5 unit in the ACC. And then special teams should be pretty good once again for North Carolina. So the Tar Heels, because they have the star power quarterback, because they have a proven coach in Mack Brown who's won a national championship and had a pretty solid year one, turning things around from the last couple of years of Larry Fedora, it's safe to say that North Carolina will be the favorite or one of the favorites in the Coastal Division along with Virginia Tech. I think that's pretty safe to say at this point. And I think the reasons why people will pick North Carolina to win the division and go on to play Clemson in the ACC championship are valid.
Got Mike McDaniel on the line from ESPN Blacksburg, Virginia Tech football pregame, allhokies.com, the key place you can catch Mike's work. That's on si.com. Again, allhokies.com. And his podcast, Hokie Hangover, Virginia Tech in the ACC. Mike's been joining us for a long time here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We got Pigskin Pete going to join the conversation as we talk up the ACC. So I'm going to leave it wide open for you, Mike, to ramble on about the ACC and where you want to take this next in regards to what this conference can do, how good it is. I'm really going to be heard as an analyst who loves to see the non-conference games if they get completely shut down, because the barometer for a college football playoff becomes null and void to a certain extent, but also just the entertainment of seeing teams get together that we never see. And hey, football is going to be football, and we all want to see some semblance of some football, a football season, but to see the same teams playing that we always are accustomed to seeing is going to be a big takeaway or detraction from what we could have seen with USC, Alabama, Oregon, Ohio State, and on down the line. But your thoughts as you scan the ACC?
Yeah, I think the one thing that could potentially come out of this, and it depends on what side of the coin you fall on, but there is a scenario that could play out here without the non-conference games where you have to now judge for a college football playoff the 4 best teams in the country based off of, in many cases, an 8-game schedule in the regular season. You could put together a college football playoff and really have to choose between what you believe are the 4 best conferences in college football. And that's been the major gripe with a lot of people for a while with the 14 playoff is that, well, there are 5 Power 5 conferences. There's a reason why it's called the Power 5. So if we're only going to let 4 of them in, we're inherently bringing in bias to the table. Well, now it'll be it won't be inherent. It won't be implied. It'll be right there out for everybody to see if there are no non-conference games. There's no way to now judge how one conference stacks up against another with some of their top teams. It's just, hey, how did you do in conference play? And how did the Pac-12 winner, for example, do in conference play? And now you have, let's say you have 5 undefeated conference champions. Then what do you do? And I think this could, in the middle of a pandemic and a potentially ridiculous season to begin with, I'm holding out hope for some regularity, but it's becoming less and less likely by the day. In a pandemic season, in a awkward and strange college football season, could this be the precedent to go from 4 teams to 8 for the college football playoff? It could be. There's been crazier things to happen in college football before, and it wouldn't surprise me for this to be the catalyst to all of a sudden say, you know what, the 4-team playoff isn't what's in the best interest of the Power 5. It's not in the best interest of the strong group of 5 teams to get an opportunity to play for a national championship. There are discussions to be had and decisions to be made potentially if we go conference only. And I think the ramifications will be vast outside of, the health and safety of the players. It's just from a pure football standpoint, it will be very interesting to see what happens should all of these conferences go conference only games for the upcoming season, because I think it makes the postseason very intriguing. It makes bowl selection, even outside of the college football playoff, very intriguing. And it makes ranking these teams all year a very difficult exercise because if you go conference-only games and you're not really playing football until October or November, when do these games really start to matter? And it seems like it'll be right from the jump. It'll be the first conference game you play is so ultimately important because you're only going to have 8 of them. Rather than having 12 full games, it's going to be an 8-game conference slate in many cases. And how are you going to progress through that schedule and make enough of a point? You're going to see ridiculous games where teams are going to try to score 70 and 80 points to make a point that they're one of the best teams in the country. And that's kind of what we're going to have to live with. It's going to be the eye test, which I think is a pertinent part of this thing every year. But it's even going to be more important in a shortened season without these non-conference games potentially. It's going to be absolutely ridiculous football. It really is. So I'm really interested to see what happens with that.
Yeah, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the ACC. We've been talking with Mike McDaniel from Hokie Hangover, allhokies.com, ESPN Blacksburg. We got Pigskin Pete joining us. I'm going to kick it to him in just a second after I make my little college football playoff spiel, which would generally be if all the conferences only play conference games. If we're going to be completely fair, there cannot be any assumptions about which conference is best. We need to throw out 2019 and everything that happened before and not go into the season with, well, the SEC is the best conference. No,
we should be doing that anyway.
We shouldn't do that anyway. Yeah. Right. If anybody watches me, yes, they know that I go on a rampage about 18 times a year about the thought that, people bringing up 2015 and 2016 and what happened then, and we got to leave this conference out because they're an embarrassment. No, we start new each and every year, but we are starting with a completely, possibly, if the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 go the way of the Big 10 and the Pac-12. So the assumption has to be, if we're being fair, is that every conference is created equal if they're only playing in-conference games. So the only way to slice it is we're going to select the teams with the 4 best records. Then there's most likely going to be a tie for the 4th spot or the 3rd and 4th spots among 3 teams. Who knows what the number is going to be. So then you got to look at, okay, who's the most dominant against their schedule? Because, again, we have to rank these schedules as being equal. And then if that flies out the window, then, Mike, exactly, it's going to go back to what seems to be more and more a factor each and every year is the premise that this committee, regardless of what they decide, they really have no parameters. They kind of fade year by year, and what becomes the mitigating claim is that we just select the 4 best teams. And that's become their defense more and more each year. We just select the 4 best teams, like they're God and they know the 4 best teams, which is ridiculous. Pigskin, how you doing today?
Hey, what's up, Mark? What's up, Mike? How you guys doing?
Hey, what's going on?
Good to see you. Good to see you. Pigskin Pete here on YouTube. So please check out his channel. Excellent college football talk. So please check it out. Pigskin Pete right here on YouTube. Subscribe on over there. Man, as this mess gets sorted out, Pigskin, what are your thoughts regarding scheduling? Which way do you think it should go? Which way do you think it will go?
Well, based on the article I read earlier today, I uploaded the video about that. Zach Lentz for SI.com. The whole pod thing, and they laid out different scenarios. There's 3 different scenarios for geographic pods in the ACC. Now, of course, the Big Ten, we know that they're at least playing 9 games because that's what they play. We don't know what else they're going to do if they're going to try to fill in a 10th game. The Pac-12 has announced they're going to 10 games, which I don't think you'll see most conferences go to 10 games, at least from the proposal I'm seeing laid out for the ACC. They're talking about 9. They're talking about the 8 conference games and then 1 non-conference game, most likely with the SEC. Now, this is the interesting part about this, is you have the 4. I heard you guys talking about this earlier. You have the 4 in-state rivals: Florida, Florida State, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina, and then Louisville and Kentucky. What about the other 10 teams for both the SEC and the ACC? Now, I'm assuming from what I could read in this article that they are in talks with the ACC to have a week where they have nothing but ACC and SEC matchups, which I think would be intriguing. In other words, you might have Auburn play North Carolina, or, just as an example, and so on and so forth. First of all, I think the ACC fans would like that. I don't know how much the SEC fans would like that, because, if you're a Texas A&M fan, do you want to see them play Wake Forest? Probably not. You'd probably see it rather than play somebody else. But look, it's coming down. Every conference is going to do this. I don't care what the ACC and the SEC commissioners have said. They're going to a conference-only schedule, and then they're going to fill in 1 more game, probably with the SEC, as far as the ACC is concerned. And of course, Notre Dame. Don't even get me started. I heard you guys talking about the Notre Dame thing, and I have to disagree with you, Mike, on the mutual beneficial thing as far as ACC and the SEC. It's much more beneficial for Notre Dame than it is for the SEC. If you look at the revenue that's generated throughout college football, it's not in ticket sales. So the ACC benefits, if they go to Florida State or Wake Forest or wherever, they're going to sell the game out because Notre Dame's coming to town. But they're not splitting that NBC money with the ACC. Right. So that's the problem that I have with it. And I'm more on Mark's side of the coin, where I would at least try to strong arm Notre Dame into joining the ACC. It probably wouldn't work, and they're certainly not going to do that, right, because the ACC is spineless in that regard. But I would at least try to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair for them to try. I just don't think it's very realistic that it'll happen. I just don't think that Notre Dame is in a position right now. Like, if we're talking about this happening in a year where Notre Dame's contract is up with NBC, then I think it's a really intriguing discussion, because all of a sudden the ACC has more leverage against Notre Dame. Notre Dame's got all the leverage with their NBC contract. If the ACC said, we're going to, you got to join our conference, or else, the schedules, future schedules moving forward are going to be different. Notre Dame's going to say, okay, see you later. And they're going to go back to doing what they were doing for 25 plus years, where they were playing USC, Michigan State, Michigan every single year, versus rotation.
But if it affected their contract as far as the ACC goes with the other sports too, that's what we're looking at here. Right. So that would cause a big storm of logistics for Notre Dame to try to reschedule their entire baseball season, basketball season, and football season without playing 5 to 6 ACC teams every year.
It would. I mean, especially since Notre Dame, once they kind of joined the ACC and every other sport, their football season, their football schedules moving forward, they got changed, right? I mean, no longer is Notre Dame playing Michigan, Michigan State, Navy, Stanford. I mean, they're playing Stanford, they're playing Navy, they're playing USC every year still, but they're no longer playing Michigan every year. They're no longer playing Michigan State every year. And that is kind of the consequence of them going and playing with and for the ACC. But the fact that they were able to keep their football independence while playing in all these other sports with the ACC, I think really benefited Notre Dame more, just purely from a sports standpoint, more than it benefited the ACC. Now, what I mean by that is Notre Dame is now in the premier basketball conference. They're in one of the best baseball conferences in the country. They are playing teams on their football schedule, like the Clemson game that was supposed to take place this year. They're playing elite games now, of no consequence to them. Now moving into a full-on ACC schedule. It's not like Notre Dame's schedule all of a sudden got a lot softer when they're playing Clemson, they're playing Florida State when Florida State's up. I think back to the game in 20, I believe it was 2015 or 16 with Jameis Winston, maybe 2014 actually, with Jameis Winston, and that was one of the premier games of the year. So it's not like Notre Dame has suffered all these consequences from playing all these ACC teams on the schedule. The ACC was down last year. It had not been down before that. Louisville was great with Lamar Jackson. Clemson has obviously been an up-and-coming power now and a dynasty now for going on 5 or 6 years. So they've been really good, and Notre Dame's benefited from that game with the Dabo Bring Your Own Guts game there a handful of years ago, and that was one of the best games of that college football season. So Notre Dame has benefited from being in the ACC for football. It's not like they've lost a whole lot. Now, whether or not they'd actually join the conference is a whole different discussion. I just still don't think they're going to do that because of the NBC contract. You remove that whole element from the table, I think Notre Dame joins the ACC. I don't think there's any reason for them not to at that point.
Well, I think that's up in 2025 or something like that contract.
Yeah, it's still 4 or 5 years out.
And look, man, I like seeing Notre Dame play Clemson on a regular or somewhat regular basis. I was at the 2015 game, the Bring Your Own Guts game you were talking about. I have tickets to the game in South Bend this year, which probably isn't going to happen based on what I'm hearing. But I still feel like I would rather push Notre Dame out of the ACC for the benefit of the ACC than just let them. There's a reason that no other conference is giving this deal.
Right.
It's because it's much more beneficial for one side, and that would be Notre Dame in this scenario. But have you Mark or Mike? Have you guys seen these pods laid out? This pod schedule for the ACC?
I have not.
I can read.
I looked at it briefly this afternoon. But
so the interesting thing about this, first of all, it's all geographic. So basically, what they did was they separated the ACC into 3 geographic regions, being North, middle or whatever, and then South, and then Notre Dame. So basically they're including Notre Dame in this, even though Notre Dame doesn't fit geographically with any of them. And all 3 scenarios, I can read them to you. You want me to read them to you?
Sure.
All right. So option number 1 would be pod A would be Miami, Florida State, Georgia Tech, North Carolina, and Duke, which somewhat makes sense. See, Clemson is the only team in South Carolina. And then all of the North Carolina teams, they're sort of in the middle of all of this. So they could really go north or south if you really want to get, specific about it. But pod B would be Virginia Tech, Virginia, Clemson, North Carolina State, and Wake Forest. That's option number 1.
It's a strong pod there.
Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like that pod. And not because of Virginia, not because of Virginia Tech, but as far as a Clemson fan, I don't care about North Carolina State or Wake Forest in this scenario.
Right.
I'd rather go play the Florida teams. Okay.
Right.
Pod C is and the Pod C is pretty much the same across the board for all these options because they're all northern teams: Syracuse, Boston College, Pittsburgh, Louisville, and of course Notre Dame. The thing that stands out, that's just option number 1. There's 2 more options, but the thing that stands out to me the most is that Notre Dame and none of these scenarios comes to Clemson or goes to Florida. So they're all either in Virginia or the northern states. But if we're talking about geographics here, Clemson is closer than Boston College is, and they have them going there twice in some of these scenarios. Also, from a money standpoint, if we're talking about, and also just a compelling standpoint, Clemson and Notre Dame is one of the most compelling matchups in college football, not just in the ACC this year. So to see them play not only once, but twice possibly, because that's what this is. This is a scenario where you play 4 teams twice in a home-and-home series to round out the 8 conference game schedule. But none of these scenarios have Clemson playing Notre Dame at all. And I don't like that, number 1. But I also think that it's counterproductive as far as the geographics work, because Notre Dame's far away from everybody.
Yeah, and the thing that bothered me too about kind of just going conference only, I mean, there are several occasions where conference teams now have to travel further to play some of their conference games than they do for some of these in-state non-conference games they play every year, these rivalry games.
Sure.
Georgia Tech playing Georgia, right down the road is a lot different than Georgia Tech, going up to Virginia or going up to the Northeast to play Boston College. Now, I know that's a crossover game, and I'm not even sure Georgia Tech plays Boston College this year. But my whole point is that you have scenarios out there, and there have been several laid out where teams are now traveling further for the conference games than they are for some of the non-conference games. And it's like, well, the whole idea about this is to keep things kind of geographically sane. I think that's a big reason for the pod system now.
Yeah.
Yes and no to a certain extent. So my thought was the same thing, Mike. When this first broke about the Big Ten, I'm sitting here recording, and then all sorts of people are texting me. So boom, I go live. Didn't give it much thought. Just bam, going live, taking calls. And my first thought was, yeah, the Big Ten stretches from upper Minnesota all the way to the East Coast and Rutgers. The ACC, these conferences with expansion in the last 10 to 15 years have become so expansive. Boston to Miami. That's the entire country, basically.
West Virginia to Texas 3 times.
Oh, my goodness. And so my first thought is, take Iowa. They play Iowa State. Boom. Got to cancel that game. That's 70 miles away. But we're going to go to Rutgers in Maryland, and we're going to travel thousands of miles away. The same thing in the ACC. And if you really, people focus on the huge matchups, non-conference, Ohio State's got to go all the way out to Oregon, and Michigan's going to Washington. But those are very infrequent. Most of these Power 5 teams schedule, especially their FCS and their Group of 5 opponents, and even their Power 5 are regional matchups. There are many in-state matchups, very close that, again, with the expansion geographically of these conferences, are the closest matchups they're going to play. Probably the closest teams in any conference are those North Carolina schools in the ACC.
Yeah, right.
Other than that, man, the Pac-12s all the way up and down the coast and out toward Utah and Colorado. I would say that the ACC, in some portions of it, has the closest proximity of schools.
Sure.
They're on Tobacco Road, but obviously is expanded to Syracuse and Boston College and Pitt.
Now,
so Pigskin, it sounds like you're more in favor of good games being played and good matchups than you are let's keep competitive balance. And it sounds like at least option A is a competitive balance in terms of trying to have good teams in each pod.
Now, listen, you want to hear option 2? Option 2 is better, at least according to me, it is.
Okay.
So option 2, pod A, Miami, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and Virginia Tech. So that puts Clemson with 2 teams in Florida, and then Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech. I like that much better than the previous one.
Clemson, Florida State, Miami are in the same pod.
Yes.
And who else?
Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech.
Well, it's by far the most talented. I don't know if it's going to be the best pod, but if Florida State and Miami can find a pulse,
I'm talking about as far as a viewership, a draw to the game.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a much better pod. And again, these are home and home. So Clemson and Miami would play each other home and home. Florida State, Virginia Tech. I mean, that would be very cool. Pod B, North Carolina State, Duke, Wake Forest, and Virginia. So it's all the North Carolina teams in Virginia. I don't know how compelling that is.
North Carolina's liking that.
Yeah.
No Virginia Tech.
I like this a lot for Virginia Tech and Clemson. I don't like it for everybody else.
Right. And then pod C would be Syracuse, Boston College, Pittsburgh, Louisville, and Notre Dame, which the pod C is like the same in every scenario because just all the teams north of the Mason-Dixon line pretty much, and Notre Dame.
Notre Dame's going to make the college football playoff.
Well, yeah, that's a whole nother. Are we going to have
Boston College home and home, and who else is in there?
Mark, that's the other question. Are we going to have a playoff? Nobody's even talked about this yet.
Yeah, that's the thing.
It matters. We talk about it.
Well, yeah. But I mean, are we going to have bowls? Are we going to have a playoff? I don't know. Because if we're not, then these schedules are pretty much insignificant. It's just about how compelling the regular season matchups are.
Yeah, and a lot of people have eyes on college football, but without the consequence of having bowl games in a college football playoff, conference championship games, that sort of thing, like, man, that would be empty calories. Not that I wouldn't watch every single minute of it and bet on the games and everything else, write about it and preview it. That's the most important thing to ever happen. I would. But the whole thing with that is, man, there's no ramifications on the postseason, and we can just play whoever we want. I mean, if that's what we're going to do, give me Clemson, give me Florida State, give me Miami,
exactly.
Give me North Carolina.
And that's where I'm coming from with this is I don't know if there's going to be a postseason, and like nobody does. So I want the best games in the regular season that I can get. You guys want to hear option number 3 so we can round this thing out?
Yep.
Do it.
All right. Pod A, Miami, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and Louisville. So Pod A is the same as option number 2 and option number 3, except for they swapped out Virginia Tech and Louisville. That's the only difference in that one.
Yeah.
Which proves to me that they don't really, it's not about geography. Now, again, like I said before, Clemson's right in the middle of all of these teams, so they can go north and south, and they did that in this pod by saying Clemson to Louisville. That's all the difference is there. Pod B, North Carolina State, Duke, Wake Forest, and Virginia. So you have the North Carolina teams and Virginia. That's the same as the one before, I think. And then Pod C is, again, all the teams from up north. Syracuse, Boston College, Pittsburgh, Notre Dame, and Virginia Tech is in that pod. How do you feel about that one, Mike? Syracuse, Boston College, Pitt, Notre Dame, Virginia Tech. At least you get to play Notre Dame twice.
You get to play Notre Dame twice. Outside of that, it's like, man, you got to play Pitt twice. You're playing BC twice. You're playing Syracuse twice. Like, oh, I don't love it.
I'd take it.
Tends to give Virginia Tech issues at Pitt, but when they come to Blacksburg, it's generally not the case. That would be kind of the only road game I'm really, really worried about. But no, don't love that. Outside of the fact you get to play Notre Dame a couple times and they're a top 10 to 15 team. Outside of that, it's like, don't love it.
I would take it just for Notre Dame. That's the one.
I better cut my scheduling video before this becomes, the guideline for 2020, because my thought was, okay, if the Big Ten has already done this with, well, the Pac-12, as Pigskin pointed out, the Pac-12 has already gone to the 10 conference games. It sounds like it's going to go the same route. So I was going to cut a video and basically say, this is the way every conference should devise their 10-game conference schedule if it comes to that. And for the ACC, I was basically doubling up on what I consider to be the meaningful rivalry games to make those home and home, Miami, Florida State being the best example, North Carolina State, but then make the next game the most intriguing. And so the Pitts and Syracuses of the world, I kicked them to the bottom. They can play each other, but I'm giving Clemson a game against, I don't value their rivalry, their quote unquote rivalry against Georgia Tech. I know their rivalry.
I don't either.
And some Clemson fans, we've got a Clemson guy, Pigskin, that comes on a regular basis, Ryan Cantor. He loves the Georgia Tech Clemson rivalry.
Look, I don't get it. And believe me, Ryan falls into the vast majority of Clemson fans. I'm not in that. I'm not in that camp though.
Yeah, I'm like, if Georgia Tech was good right now, I'd say, well, we'll get them to play again, and it'll help both cases. But for me, I'm just protecting the rivalries that I value, either because I consider them real rivalries like North Carolina State, or because they mean something. So for Clemson, I came up with Miami and North Carolina as their 2 additional games. I didn't value any of the rivalries there. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I basically just went with attractive matchups to round out the ACC schedule of 10 games, if it comes to that. When you brought up, Pigskin, the thought that if there is one non-conference game played for the ACC, it's going to be a strictly 14 versus 14, SEC versus ACC, that would pretty much eliminate the Big 12 and force their hand to do the same thing as the Pac-12 and the Big 10. So suddenly I became a bigger fan of ACC and SEC football because I get to see non-conference games that are mostly compelling, and those are the only non-conference games we get. So I'm locked in on those matchups, and they can't all be great, but I'm locked in on those matchups.
Yeah, but mathematically though, the Big 12 can't do what the Pac-12 and the Big 10 are doing because there's only 10 teams. They'd have to play somebody twice. That's all.
Yeah.
Right.
Play Oklahoma and Texas again.
Right. Yeah. You could do that, which actually would be pretty cool. I mean, who wouldn't want to see a home and home between them?
And that's the way I set it up with the Big Ten. I thought, you know what? This is a wild card year anyway. You might as well bring more attention and money to your conference by playing more attractive matchups if you're adding conference games.
Well, there was the scenario where Virginia Tech plays Notre Dame twice, I guess, with the option 3 for the pod system. I mean, I would love to see Tech play Notre Dame twice to replace that Penn State game that was supposed to be played the second week of September. I mean, all of a sudden you're getting another top 10 team to just slide in there. Now you're playing them twice. I mean, I tend to side with, hey, let's just make this good matchups. Now, for schools like Wake Forest who have a fine program, They play good football under Dave Clawson.
Ew.
Yeah, they're getting the short end of the stick on this, but also like Wake Forest playing Clemson and Notre Dame probably isn't going to be the most compelling television twice.
That's true.
Take place. So it kind of is what it is. I mean, Wake Forest tends to try to punch above their weight a bit in the ACC by what they've done under Clawson, but at the same time, when you put them up against elite teams, it's not going to be as competitive. And that just kind of is what it is. And I'll hurt a lot of Wake Forest fans and NC State fans and Duke fans, but it just kind of is what it is. You got to throw them to the side.
And while we're focusing, of course, on the ACC, I'll use the Big Ten as a case example since they've gone to this 10 game. It appears as though, because I'm thinking the conferences can be sending a message in how they rework this conference schedule in 3 different ways. They're either saying to everyone, we're looking out for the health of the players by limiting travel, which I don't think really comes into play that much.
It never had.
If you get on a plane or a bus, you're getting on a plane or a bus, whether you're traveling 50 miles or 500 miles.
Right.
But it tends to send a message because people seem to get a little paranoid about that. Or number 2, you can go with the approach, this is a wild card year. We want to set up the most attractive games. And 15 years from now, we're still talking about Clemson and Florida State played home and home or whatever it is. It's just kind of cool. So why not go, this is a funky year, we're going to play it up. And in the Big Ten's case, play as many Ohio State, Penn State kind of games as you can. Match those teams up again. Or you go the third route and you try to protect your best option for a college football playoff and you protect them. So you don't want maybe you don't want Ohio State exposed to another Wisconsin, Penn State game, for example, or Clemson to a North Carolina, Florida State, Miami game. And you try to protect your college football playoff interests.
Yeah, listen, the travel thing, the conference only scheduling never had anything to do with travel. It had to do with being able to control what you can control,
yes,
eliminating a few games. And that way, if let's say there's a coronavirus outbreak for one team, if you miss a week, then you'll just have a bye week or whatever that week, and you can still play the games. Whether there's fans there or not is irrelevant. But I agree with you. If look, they're already going to be losing a massive amount of money with ticket sales if they limit fans or have no fans at all. So to make up that money, the best thing to do is have the most compelling matchups. And I realize if you're Wake Forest or if you're Duke or somebody like that, or Georgia Tech, you're going to get the short end of the stick on this deal, because you're going to be playing each other because they're going to be putting the Clemsons with the Virginia Techs and the Miamis and the Notre Dames. But again, if it's all about money for the conference and all about money for the schools, and they can share the money like they normally do, then the best thing to do is just make the most compelling matchups the best way that you can, and under the circumstances,
and recoup all the money lost from all these massive non-conference games like Alabama, USC, Ohio State, Oregon that aren't going to be played. Imagine if Clemson and Notre Dame play at Clemson, and it's a great game, or regardless of what the outcome, but there's a return trip to South Bend, 6 weeks later.
Sure.
Or Miami, Florida State, with as crazy as they are about beating each other and that rivalry. We got a return trip to Miami coming up in 6 weeks.
Right. I could care less about either one of those teams, but watching them fight online is priceless. Miami and Florida State people.
Yeah, I would love to see Ohio State and Michigan play a home and home series. It'd be phenomenal.
Sure, absolutely.
So yeah, good stuff with Pigskin Pete. Join him right here on YouTube. Does a great job covering college football. Mike McDaniel here in the center, and his many, many platforms that I try to keep track of. Hokie Hangover, allhokies.com, and helps out with Virginia Tech football pregame on ESPN Blacksburg. The ACC, so is this pretty much, obviously, Clemson's got the big separation on everyone else. I threw this out to Mike earlier. Pigskin is, are you as intrigued with North Carolina as I am? They intrigue me more than anybody in the country. And while I'm looking forward to was looking forward to the huge non-conference matchups, Oregon, Ohio State, USC, Alabama, I am saddened by not being able to see North Carolina, Auburn, North Carolina, UCF, because I wanted to see the Heels play those games before they dove into the ACC and slummed around with Pitt and Duke and the rest of the Coastal Division. I wanted to see those two games to see how real UNC could possibly be.
I am completely all in on UNC, and I wasn't a year ago. When I thought when they hired Mac Brown that he was sort of somebody that was just going to come change the culture and be a figurehead and that sort of thing. But as far as football goes, forget everything else. I mean, look at the way they're recruiting right now. It's unbelievable. And the play on the field looks good. And I don't think Mac Brown's going anywhere in the next 4 or 5 years. I think he'll be there for a while. And I even said, I made a video about this the other day, is that I think what you're going to see, unfortunately for people like Mike who are Virginia Tech fans, I think you're going to see somewhat of a rivalry happen between most likely Clemson out of the Atlantic and North Carolina and the Coastal over the next few years in the ACC championship. Now we'll see what Miami does. I was on the Justin Fuente bandwagon for 3 years at least. And I've hopped off that bandwagon now. I don't know how you feel about him.
So I like Fuente, like as a coach. Now his downfall or shortcomings so far have been recruiting. Tech had the worst class in the Power 5 last year on the recruiting trail. They are inside the top 50 this year.
So stop right there, Mike. Highlight that for a second. We're talking about Virginia Tech for the better part of 1995 up until about 5 to 10 years ago, one of the top 10 programs in the nation, still one of the top 25-ish programs in the nation. And we consistently see Georgia Tech, Boston College in like the 70s in their recruiting ranking.
Yeah.
Virginia Tech had the worst in Power 5.
Worst class in the Power 5. I think they came in at 74th, if I'm not mistaken. They were the worst class in the Power 5 last year. Now, it was a small class to begin with numbers, but you can't point to that and say that's the reason why they had the worst recruiting class. They had the worst recruiting class in the Power 5 because they missed out on several top targets. The issue that Justin Fuentes had since he got to Blacksburg is that he has not recruited the state of Virginia well, in particular the two hotbeds, Northern Virginia and the Tidewater region, in Virginia Beach, right along the border there. Those are two areas where Frank Beamer consistently recruited at a very high clip. And when you're getting that kind of talent out of the state of Virginia, one of the top football states in the country now, Virginia is among the top 7 or 8 states for high school football in the country. And Virginia Tech has not been able, with this coaching staff so far, to relate to those kids. Now, Justin Fuente acknowledged that he made some changes on his coaching staff, some guys that were a little weaker on the recruiting trail, brought in now Justin Hamilton, who's the new defensive coordinator, has been on the staff a few years now, but he's from the state of Virginia. They hired Darryl Tapp, who's a former All-ACC player for Virginia Tech on the defensive line. He's from the state of Virginia. They recently hired Jerron Gavea-Winslow, who was a linebacker for Virginia Tech from 2010 to 2014. He was a guy who was a 3-year team captain under Frank Beamer, a relatable face for these players in the state of Virginia. He's a guy who's from Fairfax, so he's from the Northern Virginia area. Stonebridge High School, which is one of Virginia Tech's top high schools that they've pulled from historically under Frank Beamer. So they're trying to make some changes on the coaching staff, on the support staff side for recruiting. You're starting to see that pay off a little bit. They've recruited the state of Virginia better. There's some top targets still out there that they haven't pulled in yet, but they're in several like top 3 to 5 lists for recruits that are coming up here over the next couple of weeks. So they're making some improvements in the recruiting area, but the issue that they're going to have now is they were last in the Power 5 last year. They're probably going to be conservatively top 35, top 40, so it'll be better than last year, but won't be great. Meanwhile, you have North Carolina, top 20 class last year. It's going to be a top 5 at worst, maybe top 10 class this year by the time everybody is signed and everybody's got their recruiting classes. And this is your prime head-to-head matchup in the Coastal. You now are facing Mac Brown, a national championship coach who now has a couple of strong recruiting classes, while your recruiting classes, these are going to be consistently, it looks like the 2 worst classes that Justin Fuentes had since he got to Blacksburg. And now you got to go head-to-head with the best quarterback in the division in Sam Howell. And you barely won that game last year with North Carolina team that barely got to a bowl game. You barely won that game a year ago in Blacksburg in 6 overtimes, and now it's kind of an equal playing field. I think this is probably the last year, realistically, that Virginia Tech can hang with North Carolina because Virginia Tech's got a very strong roster returning this year. This is probably the last year that Virginia Tech can hang with North Carolina on the field. I think next year, if they're not an underdog this year, I think next year they'll be an underdog. The year after that, they could be an underdog. And I think these classes that you're seeing from Virginia Tech, these lower ranked recruiting classes, will come back to haunt them, especially when they're now going up against premier talent in their own division. A team that is trying to gun for Clemson. This is what Virginia Tech has tried to do under Fuente for a while. They wanted to gun for Clemson. Well, they had some strong recruiting classes Fuente's first 3 years. The crossover year with Beamer and the next 2 were actually pretty good recruiting classes. They were top 20, 25 recruiting classes, which is where Virginia Tech has always been. But since then, it's slipped a bit. Meanwhile, North Carolina is on the ascent on the recruiting trail, and they're right there with you on the field. And I think that's what the issue is going to be for the Hokies moving forward for a prognosis with the rest of the Coastal. They need to close the gap on recruiting, or else they're going to be in huge trouble.
Sure. You just mentioned a bunch of defensive changes. Obviously, Bud Foster's leaving, and you mentioned a lot of the defensive changes that are taking place. But the defense, as it, it's been sort of up and down over the past 5 years or so. Some years better than others, even under the legend Bud Foster. But the real problem is the offense. So let's talk about that. That's the reason they brought Justin Fuente in there. Quarterback's been a problem, receiver's been a problem, offensive line's been a problem. Had a couple of pretty good running backs, but just across the board. And by the way, the offensive philosophy, I mean, the offense for Virginia Tech under a offensive coach, like I said, Justin Fuente, has been massively disappointing. That's what they need to fix.
I agree. Especially so real quick on the defensive side, right? Like 2 years ago, they had, first of all, they won 6 games, and it was a bad year, and it led to a bad recruiting class. But they had unprecedented turnover on the defensive side of the football, then had injuries on top of it. It was a very weird year. So I was willing to give them a pass. But then the beginning part of last year, the defense was so poor in the month of September. Duke goes into Blacksburg. Duke doesn't even make a bowl game last year. Duke goes into Blacksburg. They blow Virginia Tech out on their home field on a Friday night in September. And that was the wake-up call for Justin Fuente and his coaching staff to make a change of quarterback. So they had Ryan Willis, who was a carryover. He was backup for Josh Jackson. He stepped in for Jackson 2 years ago when he got hurt. He comes in as a senior last year. He starts the first 4 games, has major turnover problems. They replace him with Hendon Hooker. Hendon Hooker was great as a starter last year. Really, really good, has an extremely high ceiling. The biggest issue with Virginia Tech's offense, and I think this is one of the issues that they've had now for a couple of years, is it's been a revolving door quarterback. They weren't healthy 2 years ago. Josh Jackson breaks his leg against Old Dominion. Ryan Willis steps in. He's fine. He's an adequate replacement, but he's a backup, and he didn't play well. They had him start the season last year, and he wasn't great. So then you're turning over at the quarterback position again with Hendon Hooker. And now you have Hendon Hooker entering his redshirt junior season after he had a very strong second half of the year last year when he became a starter. Finally, there's some stability at the quarterback position. Behind him, there are 2 4-star quarterbacks, Braxton Burmeister and Quincy Patterson. So you have the most stability you've ever had at the quarterback position, which is crucial.
That is true. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. More importantly, the offensive line. I don't think this is talked about enough, how bad the offensive line has been for the last 3 years under Fuente. Finally, I think the offensive line this year has the opportunity to become a strength. You have several returning starters on the offensive line. You're adding Brock Hoffman, who's coming in from Coastal Carolina as a transfer. He was a very good player at the FCS level. He's going to come in with 2 years of eligibility remaining on the offensive line. So that should be an instant impact player at center to anchor the line, which is so incredibly crucial. And Virginia Tech, most importantly, hasn't run the ball well. So that kind of ties into the offensive line. Virginia Tech, when they were really good under Frank Beamer for the entire 2000s and the early 2010s, they ran the ball extremely well. They had Ryan Williams and Lee Suggs and David Wilson, you name it, they had them. And they haven't really had that kind of running back in Blacksburg for a really long time. And they have a few impact guys on the roster right now. They have Khalil Herbert transferring in out of Kansas. If you're a good running back at Kansas, you can be a good running back anywhere, I'm convinced. So they have him coming in as a transfer. They have Keyshawn King, who was very good as a freshman last year, stepping in as in his sophomore year. He's going to be an important player. So I think finally the pieces could come together. The one question mark I have on the offense is at receiver. Damon Hazelton transfers out of the program. He was the leading receiver last year. He moves on to Missouri. You still have Trey Turner, who is a 4-star receiver, and he's been very good in the ACC now for a number of years. So you have him returning as a junior. But then you have a lot of young guys, right? You have Tavion Robinson, who's going to be a true sophomore. You lose Dalton Keene to the NFL. He enters the NFL draft early. So there's some question marks at receiver. They don't have a lot of proven talent there, which is something I'm a little bit concerned about. But as far as the offensive line is concerned, the quarterback play is concerned, the running back room is concerned, this is probably the strongest it's been in probably 3 years for Virginia Tech. So the pieces are there. The coaching staff's there. The final piece to the Frank Beamer puzzle, you're able to kind of cut the cord on Bud Foster. He's gone. It's prove it time for Justin Fuente and this coaching staff. These are all his guys. These are all his players, all his coaches. If you get out to the kind of start you had last year, they're going to find out that they're going to find that buyout money pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say one last question, Mark. I don't want to hijack your show, but I'm fascinated with Virginia Tech. So while I have Mike here, I want to ask you this question. So the fan base, I think, is probably getting a little bit tired of Fuente. And I would say if it weren't for coronavirus and what's going on now, this was the make it or break it year. Do you think that what's going on as far as the shortened season, however that plays out, does that buy him another year no matter what happens this year?
That's a great question and something I haven't really thought about too much. I put so much stock into the full season and the fact that they were going to have this, and it was kind of going to be their opportunity to kind of prove it, right? Last year was probably a year too early just because I didn't have a ton of faith in Ryan Willis, not as like this. I didn't think he'd be as bad as he was in September, but I didn't think he was going to be like good enough to push Virginia Tech to the ACC championship last year. I thought 8-4, 9-3, and missing out on the conference championship game was pretty realistic. And they ended up winning 8 games last year, so that'd be kind of being right in line with that, despite all the issues they had in September. With a shortened season, to be honest with you, I'd have to see kind of what the schedule ends up looking like. Right. If Virginia Tech goes up against Clemson twice and they lose 2 games that they were expecting to be on the schedule, I mean, you almost have to give Fuente a pass. But if they played kind of the schedule as is, and it was like these 8 conference games, and then you figured out the other 2, and it was kind of like the schedule that you thought you were going to have minus Penn State, then if, Virginia Tech underwhelms, then maybe you can evaluate Fuente a little bit better than you ordinarily would, just kind of given the circumstances of everything that's going on. But that's a great question. And I think it's a question that a lot of Virginia Tech fans are going to be posing depending on how well how well Virginia Tech plays or how poorly they play. I think these people are going to be asking those same questions among the fan base.
Yeah.
So Khalil Herbert, by the way, of course, Virginia Tech has that non-division, quote-unquote, rivalry game against Boston College that I completely detest and hate. Match up the real rivals, North Carolina State, Miami, Florida State. You don't need to match the rest. Not everybody has to have a cross-division rival. But anyway, Virginia Tech, Boston College play every year, and Khalil Herbert against BC with Kansas last year ran for 187 yards and a touchdown on 11 carries. And to Mike's point, had a nice little career with KU, about 1,700 yards and 15 touchdowns.
He's a good player. Does it translate to the ACC? You hope so. And this is going to be the best offensive line Virginia Tech's had in a while. So if they can't establish a running game with this offensive line, there's no hope for the running game under Justin Fuente. It's as simple as that.
Brother Bear asking, Mark, will you do more conference shows with other conferences? I don't know. It's not necessarily in the plan. It just kind of came together. But me, shoot, I would do a Purdue live stream, Kansas State, whoever. I would do anybody. So we're here to talk college football regardless. So, all right, guys, it's been a good time. Certainly would love to have you both back, and you're always welcome. You guys know that. Pigskin, catch him here on YouTube. Mike McDaniel, of course, doing all sorts of Virginia Tech platforms, including Hokie Hangover, all Hokies.com and ESPN Blacksburg. So check these two out.
Yeah.
Good conversation, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I just hope we have a college football season. Praise Jesus.
Let's
Praise Jesus.
We have anybody playing anybody, whatever the schedule turns out to be.
Yeah.
We got a little exclusive live stream coming up tonight at 7 o'clock. So if you're interested in talking college football directly with me, just let me know in the comment section of any of the videos. And we've got about 10 or 15 on the line coming up for an exclusive live stream at 7 o'clock. All right, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Thank you.